and I am very pleased to welcome Miriam Gill this evening. She is the secretary and a principal tutor at Leicester Vaughan College, which I've already talked about. She's also worked for, oh my goodness, a whole variety of institutions, and I won't name them all now, but Cambridge and Oxford continuing education are amongst them. She is an expert on medieval church iconography from I guess back to the 13th century or even before that, perhaps, Miriam, I don't know. But she's a widely published author on that. This particular piece of research that she has conducted and that she's going to be speaking about this evening when we hear about the three living and the three dead is part of or has been derived from a chapter that you've done with Ellie Pridgeon, which is in a book called Dance Macabre, I believe. Most of you will know what the Dance Macabre is, I think, at least in general terms, which is going to be published by Brill. Is that right? Good. All right. Well, I'm getting it all right. It's going to be published by Brill later this year, I hope. So this is a fantastic piece of research. I'm very much looking forward to this for many months now. So we're going to sit back and enjoy, if that's possible. And I hope it's not too spooky for you. Maybe I should have launched some trigger warnings as well. The Three Living and the Three Dead by Dr Miriam Gill. Thank you very much, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Stu. Thank you for your warm welcome and for inviting me to speak to Curious Histories and for promoting Leicester Vaughan College. We're a community benefit society, cooperative society, and we're aiming to reinstitute the availability of higher education level adult education in our city. So that's something that's very dear to my heart. The dead men walking. Stu was right to suggest that there might be a sense that some of this material should carry a trigger warning. It was always material that was meant to be, a bit heart-shaking and striking and shocking. You will have seen this fantastic mural, which was chosen for our publicity. It's a mural painting in Tus Church in Denmark. And the main point I want to draw from this is that this topic that we're going to look at, this subject, the three living and the three dead, by the later 15th, early 16th century, this can be found across Europe. So from Scandinavia down to Southern Europe. And we'll see that it's found in quite a broad variety of different media, different types of materials and different contexts. It is a very popular subject in mural painting and for decorating walls. And I'm going to unfold to you something of this subject and its origins and its meaning, the context that it comes out of and the challenges that it presents to us. But we start with just looking at this image. You can see here on the left-hand side, we have three crowned living figures. They are dressed for the mid to late 15th century in the height of fashion. They are differentiated by their hairstyle and their facial hair, such that the figure in the centre of the picture, so the figure who's riding first, is a figure without a beard, with light hair. This is a characterisation of a young figure. Then we have a mature figure, a middle-aged figure, and finally, bringing up the rear, we have an older figure. So we have, broadly speaking, the three ages of man represented by these three monarchs. They are out hunting, mounted on horseback, the first one flying a bird of prey, and there are hunting dogs alongside them. And then they meet the three dead men walking. They converse with them. You can see here we have banderoles, speech scrolls, which are in Latin. So the one which is uppermost, which goes over the heads of the three skeletons, the three dead figures, it starts with "heu," so alas. In Latin, they lament and cry out with horror as they meet these three vivified but clearly very dead figures. The figures walk towards them, they raise their hands, and as perhaps is typical in folklore, when the living address the dead respond. And they are shown, as you can see, with the same crowns that the living wear. So they are the counterparts, the social equals, potentially the deceased ancestors of the living figures. And they speak words of warning to them. And you can see that these skeletal figures are hung with vermin, with worms, which loop around their bodies in and out of the skulls of the figures. So I've said this is a subject that we find in manuscripts, in murals, in panel painting. It becomes latterly also commonly shown in woodcuts, which represent these same sort of devotional books. Very often it would accompany, for example, the Office of the Dead. So it has particular locations in religious books. This is an example, a beautiful example from the Psalter of Bonn of Luxembourg, just around the time of the first outbreak of the Black Death. We have, as you can see again here on the left-hand side, three living figures overcome with horror and dismay. And on the right-hand side, we have three dead figures. And with these dead figures, you can see the same phenomenon that we observed with the living figures in the mural from Denmark. You remember there, starting from the centre, and this is an image which works often from the centre out. It's often described as being a mirror, and if you think about this being a mirror reflection, it's that centre, the gutter there between the two pages of the book, as the book is opened, that forms that central line. You look at the three living and the three dead, so looking at them from left to, if you look at the three dead, sorry, from left to right here, you can see that just as we have the idea of three ages of man, with these three dead figures, we have a move from a figure that has been relatively recently buried, so a figure with the arms still crossed across the chest and most of the shroud still in place. So medieval people were typically buried naked, wrapped in a shroud. Once we get to the central figure, the limbs are working loose. The figure raises its hand in greeting. The shroud has become much more fragmentary, and it only partially covers the body. And when you look at that final figure, you have a skeleton with, when we come in close, you can see there's just some sort of sense of the remains of flesh on this desiccated corpse. Sometimes this idea of different ages that these people have lain in the grave is also demonstrated through the vermin on the bodies, and that these images often show a very practical knowledge of the different types of vermin on corpses of different ages, going there into the point where you simply have bones. I'm talking tonight about the iconography where we have dead figures walking. In Southern Europe, there's commonly a variant on this story, which you can see here in the famous murals in the Campo Santo from Pisa. In this variant, the affluent, elevated, elite figures here again on their horses, they are stopped by a hermit, and rather than meeting reanimated or renouveau figures, they meet a hermit who shows them, who opens a series of tombs to confront them the reality of death. So you can see here, if you look down the left-hand side, we have the rather bulky figure of the hermit. He's pointing to a scroll, which is now illegible. And then see, slightly damaged down the left-hand side there, you can see three figures in varying degrees of composition in those three coffins, with the interest again in the vermin and the sense of moving from a figure here, a figure buried in their garments. So again, you can see, as we saw with those crown-wearing skeletons, you can see here that this figure is the equal of the well-dressed and elegant figures who hold their noses as the tombs are opened to them. And this story here is associated with the idea of the story of hermits and the hermit life, and we have seen from the lives of the Desert Fathers, the early hermits here. When we think about the three living and the three dead, it comes a little bit before a number of other types of macabre or memento mori representations we have in the later Middle Ages. So the representation in tomb sculpture of figures, as skeletons, or figures here with vermin upon them. This is something that on the whole comes slightly later and is often used to demonstrate a contrast between a buried corpse and the abasement and the decay of the buried corpse, in contrast to the typical medieval effigy, where you're shown with all of your signs of status, with all of your best clothes and your most elegant appearance. The other idea that this relates to is the idea of the dance of death, which we'll talk about at the end of the lecture. That again that's a 15th century motif, broadly speaking. These sorts of motifs draw on a long monastic tradition of creating a sense of humility and somber reflection on the shortness of life, the transience of life, the vanity of worldly achievement and worldly riches, by looking at bones and meditating on death and bones and corpses. So this culture is coming from a monastic context, and what we see in a number of places in the later Middle Ages is it becomes much more vividly expressed through expensive and lavish works of art created for a lay context, for rulers and people of high status. The other thing that I want you to see, and this is, I'm just going to talk about this very briefly, but one of the things that happens in the period around 1300 is the development of the idea of representing a skeleton. You might not think some of these skeletons are very anatomical, but you can broadly see what the artist is trying to do in these images. And this image of the skeleton, by the later 14th century, becoming the accepted emblem of death. Now, we're so used to the idea that if you wanted to show death, you would show a skeleton, a deceased human person, and that seems very natural to us. But in the allegorical art of the 12th and 13th century, we don't find that. We find various different looking figures shown to represent death. So if you look here, we've got a figure representing the death of human death, mortal death, climbing up a ladder. You can see it's a female figure holding a tomb lid or a coffin lid. And when you look at the image in colour here, you can see this is a sort of earthy, brown coloured figure, but a dressed figure, a female figure. This is a different version of the same topos. You can see here we have a very pale female figure in a white garment, also holding this sort of representation of a tomb lid or a coffin. And in a related depiction of this same subject in a mural painting, here you have the figure of death as this, grotesque naked figure attacking a figure representing sin. It's only really as we get into the later part of the 14th century that you see the figure you have here on the left-hand side, the skeleton representing death. So we've got this change in the more general visualization of death going on here, which may have something to do with the way in which people were interacting with dead bodies. It may have something to do with different burial practices. So our theme is, while out hunting, three high-level men, usually kings, meet three dead figures who warn them that they are mortal. What I'm showing you here is probably the earliest representation of this subject. It accompanies a poem by Baudouin de Condé. It's dated to circa 1285. And you can see in this image, the motif is already well established. We have the living figures shown as hunters, represented by the hawk that the leading figure holds on their wrist, and we have this motif with the figures of the dead, of differentiating them, showing them in different stages of decay, and representing them, as you can see, confronting the living, presenting themselves to the living. This is a motif that arises in late 13th century French language, so vernacular written literature associated with the court of France, the court of Flanders. De Condé is one of 5 authors, only some of whom we have a name for, who write poems almost contemporaneously about this topic. It may well be that there is even an incident in which these poets are encouraged to compete with each other, making these poems of this encounter. However, when we look at that image that I just showed you, there are some details in it, such as the hawk. They are not described in the poem which this accompanies. So it looks as if even in this first phase, in which we have these poetic versions of the story, this often represented as a dialogue between the figures, being written down, the images are already floating free from this diverse textual tradition, and there is interplay between the different versions of the text, the different versions of the poems. Then, very rapidly, we see a switch from French language, vernacular, courtly culture, entertainment for elite figures based on extensive written literature, to showing this figure on the walls of parish churches. And we know of, or have surviving, over 50 murals of this theme in parish churches in England. They're nearly all in parish churches. See 1 or 2 examples which break that rule, but almost exclusively in parish churches, over 30 of them from the 14th century. So there is a very rapid adoption of this theme. Sometimes we can link these with people who perhaps have that sort of status that we've been thinking about with these figures. So this is part of a painted scheme around the tomb of Sir John de Boutetot, the first Lord Boutetot. And you can see there it's an elaborate scheme around this canopy associated with his tomb and chantry chapel, and the painting there showing the 3 living. We've lost the 3 dead in this case, but the 3 living there on the far right hand side of that lower tier. We have some paintings which show the 3 living in particular mounted on horseback, as with some of the examples that we've seen from the continent in manuscripts and frescoes, but in most instances they're shown walking. All the paintings that we're looking at, pretty much without exception, would have been covered over at the time of the Reformation, typically in the 1540s. And when these paintings have been uncovered again, often they are fragmentary, they're damaged. So we saw there the area showing the 3 figures of the 3 dead was lost. In this painting, this is a palimpsest, really. Wall paintings are vertical archaeology. You have layers of painting. And if you look at the right-hand side of this, you can see we've got our 3 dead very clearly shown there in silhouette with their the middle one with the hand raised. But then you've got this extraordinary leg and pointed foot coming down there on the right-hand side. That is a later layer of painting. That's a figure from a 15th century painting, very commonly, particularly in the early 20th century, late 19th century, when people uncovered these paintings, they would reveal certain different layers of painting simultaneously. So these would not have been visible at the same time, but because of the way they've been uncovered, you have fragments now preserved from different layers of painting. Many of the paintings are damaged, and many of them actually are lost, and we only know them through antiquarian records, sometimes just through written descriptions in notes and church guides, and often in drawings and articles made for local antiquarian magazines. So this is an image that was created for Norfolk Archaeology, a painting now lost at Gorleston. You can see here we've got that differentiation of the kings by their ages. On the left-hand side with actually the youngest. On the far left-hand side, we've got the animated gestures of the living figures and the quite frontal presentation of the dead figures. In some cases where these paintings were found in the 19th century, people were quite excited about them, and they, rather than recording and destroying them, they wanted to preserve them. They wanted often to restore them to what was believed to be their original appearance. But sometimes in doing that, they misrepresented what the paintings were. So this is a very famous example at Lutterworth from about 1335. We've got these three regal figures, originally from a series of the three living and the three dead. If you look at the lower part of the painting, that's nearly all 19th century. It's just been added in. You can see in the 19th century, there was a beautiful ornate border extended all the way around these figures, going up where now you can see revealed once more the grinning Cheshire cat grin of the first dead figure. Lutterworth Church is associated with the proto-Protestant reformer, the Lollard John Wycliffe. When these paintings were found, they were believed to be of the royal figures who had been Wycliffe's patrons and protectors, to be Richard II, Anne of Bohemia, so thinking the middle figure was a female figure, and John of Gaunt. And they were preserved because they were considered to be portraits of historical royalty, and the figures of the dead were conveniently covered over and literally cut out by the border. This is just to show you in the early 14th century what to us looks like a very feminine presentation with this sort of long bobbed hair. This was fashionable hair. Many men were clean shaven, and this was how they presented themselves. So it looks very female to us, but this is not. These are not on the whole female figures. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the manuscripts in a moment, but one of the things that's really interesting is for a subject that is first found in French vernacular literature in England, it's also very strongly associated with the vernacular and with a diverse range of vernacular sources, but it is not, you don't have any equivalent of any long literary creation, any long narrative poem of the subject. Rather, we have these little rhymes. So this is particularly nice. You can see these have been written in and linked to the three figures by little red lines and by gestures. We see because the painting, the subject begins from the middle, the inscriptions for the dead figures read from left to right, and you can see they go round the margin. These are clearly poetic tags which are familiar, and where including the poetic tag is more important than making it look tremendously elegant. On the left-hand side, it's more complicated, and you can see there are these red lines that come down. If you look at that, the figure that's holding the hawk, the leading figure, you can see between his 2 feet, there's a red line that goes down and it goes to the word ich. And so he said, the living say, Ich am aghast. I'm aghast. Me thinketh that I think I see, that yonder stand devil and three, that there stand three devils. And the dead reply, He was well fair, I was well fair, such shalt thou be, such shall thou be, for goddess love, beware by me. You can see here that, as is common in folk tradition across Europe and into Latin and Arabic contexts, the dead speak in rhyme, and both parties here speak in rhyme. The living speculate about the nature of this apparition before us, and they reach for the idea that these are devils. The dead, by contrast, stress that they are deceased people, and they were as the living are, and also that they have come that the living should take warning by them. And this is the bit of this which is rather like the Christmas Carol in a sense. The dead appear and approach the living in these early representations for the good of the living, for their salvation, for their spiritual edification. And although their appearances are grotesque and terrifying, they are essentially benign figures, sometimes understood to be the ancestors, even the parents of the dead figures. So they are benign, they are kin, they come to warn for the good of the living. Whereas the living speculate, and this period is marked by a whole general appearance in sermon texts and other such writings of what you might describe as the urban myths or the folk culture around ideas of the reanimated dead, the revenant, people who have come back from the dead and who wander about. And the interesting thing about this literature is that the literature is it holds a variety of different approaches to these figures. We were talking about this, myself and Stu. Are these, as we would describe them, zombies? Not exactly, but there is a folk culture that sits behind these stories about the dead who won't lie down and what they are up to, and are they corpses reanimated by devils, or are they, in a sense, ghosts and returnees? This is a slightly earlier image, and what I want you to see is that we have here a version of the same dialogue, but not the same dialogue. And in the case of both of these inscriptions, this is the only writing in Middle English in these beautiful elite manuscripts. It must have been hugely striking. The people who owned these books probably spoke Middle English at home to each other, but they would rarely expect to read material in Middle English. They would probably read what we might call literature, entertaining literature in Anglo-Norman French. So within these books, these figures, they look out. You can see the dead figure on the right-hand side. They look out at us and they speak in the vernacular. This is probably the earliest of these manuscript images. And its form, and the two images we have here, the one we've just looked at and a related French image, they relate to the earliest documentary reference we have to this subject in England. So this comes from 1302, 1303, and it's a record of a purchase in London by Count Amadeus V of Savoy. And he's buying a diptych, so two panels with a central hinge, so like the opening of a book, of the Legenda Famosa, the famous legend of the three living and the three dead. So we have a sense that even very start of the 14th century, this is the famous legend, and a visitor in London was able to buy a panel painting of this subject. When you look at these images, you can see that idea of the central divide, this mirror from which the subject works out. You can see perhaps particularly in the image there on the right, the way in which the two sets of figures are sort of mirror images of each other, but working out from that central point. You can see the contrast in the background, particularly the little closed up for the night daisies and the green. Maybe this is, you know, pushing up the daisies, and maybe this is the appearance of a medieval cemetery that we see behind the dead figures on that right-hand side. You will have noticed that there is a very clear resemblance between these early French images I've been showing you and the pose of the figures in some of these early paintings. And this is very interesting because it enables us to think about how this subject is transferred. How does something go from being this apparently elite, courtly, secular subject to being, as it were, a much more widely disseminated subject on the walls of a parish church? If we look at the pose of the figures here in this earliest representation, or here slightly later where the manuscript, the poems appear alongside other secular romance literature, so the Roman de la Rose, Romance of the Rose. And you can think about this. This is a sort of romance story. It's about a hunting trip that goes wrong. It's about an adventure. It's about a quest. It gives a moralizing spin to the sort of story that aristocrats would be used to reading, you know, with these three, you know, nobles or these three kings, and they went out hunting. Who did they meet? You can see the relationship between those two images. A slightly different image here with the leading of the dead figure raising their hands. It's another example of a manuscript where we've got these multiple poems on this theme preserved in a single manuscript. There are only 5 representations of the legend in English medieval manuscripts, and there's only one manuscript, this is the de la Psalter here, where you've also got the text of the poem, one of those poems that comes from the vernacular French tradition. All these manuscripts are from the first half of the 14th century. There's a list for you of them there for you. But we also almost immediately have wall paintings across the country. So probably one of the earliest wall paintings is from Wensley in Yorkshire, 1300 or maybe a bit earlier. And you can see this painting also has text in it, you know, highly localized, you know, vernacular text. As we are now, thus shall you be, take warning from me, this beware wit me. It's a sort of northern form, Yorkshire form of that expression. You can see here the worms hanging from the bodies of the dead and these inscriptions between them. That earliest French model is most closely followed in one of the paintings which isn't in a parish church. It's in the painted chamber of Longthorpe Tower, a house created for the stewards of Peterborough Abbey. And, here, the darkened colour that you see here, this is pigment alteration. This is one of the other bad things that happen to mural paintings. But you can see the gestures, particularly of the dead. The pointing gesture, the speaking gesture of the leading king is different, but the gestures of the dead figures are all very carefully follow that first, earliest French example. We then have a series of murals which relate strongly to the to the de la Psalter. So here you've got Beltram Water on the left. You can see the style is different, but lots of the details are all the same. The de la Psalter is the work of a man called, or an artist, maybe a man or a woman, but an artist called the Madonna Master, named after this image of the Madonna. And the interesting thing about them is that we know that they worked with a variety of different media. So they were a designer, almost an design impresario, creating designs for different media. Here, for example, we have a panel from a cope, so an embroidered panel. You can see how closely the design connects with their manuscript work. Although this image that I'm showing you was also made for the de la family, When we compare it with our earlier de la Salter image, there are some interesting variants. One is the reality that it doesn't seem to actually fit within the border. In the transfer of that image, you can see the left-hand side of that left-hand king has been largely lost. So something has gone wrong here in terms of scaling the transfer of the model. You can also see that the artist seems to have had trouble knowing what to do with the hand of the central figure, so that their hand is coming back towards them and then they're holding a glove that's going in the other direction. Most notably of all, the leftmost king isn't holding a scepter, which is an attribute that is introduced in the de la Salter. Now, if you are going hunting, even if you are a king and you like to go hunting with your crown on, you do not want to go hunting with your scepter. It is not a useful object. It is not a weapon. It is not part of the practice of hunting. And so this use of the scepter is very much around identifying these figures as regal, as kings. And it's very interesting that probably more or less at the same time that the Madonna Master works on this manuscript, they are also working on the Sedilia in Westminster Abbey, which has on it a series of holy kings, all pointing at their sceptres. We can see interchange between these different representations in the manuscripts, but it's only when we look to these mural paintings that we see this frankly illogical scepter introduced by the Madonna Master being put into the mural paintings. Here we see it at Little Tay. You can see that then as a diagonal line going from out on the upper left down to the right. I know these pictures are very difficult to see. You can understand here how we have to group these images to think about them. And the scepter, which, as I say, makes no sense in terms of the idea of hunting, going hunting, remains really, really popular in the English corpus. And I think we can see where that comes from. We can see a particular person and a particular image then being disseminated. Once we get after about 1320, 1330, the images are no longer so tightly tied to those models. The images, you can see here, they start to spread out, different sorts of gestures are used. There's a general reference to that whole elite culture, the culture of hunting and hawking, dogs and the landscape of hunting and the quarry of hunting, and also perhaps a reference to the idea of quest and romance, going out on apparently ordinary activity and journey and meeting something uncanny, something from another realm and another place. And in the Smithfield Decretals, which is a set of Roman law books where you have lots and lots of running narratives across the bottom of the page, this is the only place where we have what appears to be an extended narrative of the three kings. And you know, the impact, it tells the impact of the meeting with the skeletons on the three living. The three living, as you can see here, are very nicely colour coded, and then we find out what the orange, the pink and the blue king go on to do after they've met the skeletons. Once we get into the middle of the 14th century, in the wall paintings, we have this similar elaboration and interest in the idea of the landscape of hunting. Here you can see the trees that go up between the skeletal figures and all the different accessories of hunting. You can see here that the hawk held on the hand. You can see that bottom left-hand corner little head of an ancillary figure, a servant looking after the hounds. Here you can see a tree in the landscape on the right-hand side. An interest in the elaboration of the figures, the elegance of the figures, you know, the sense of them being very fashionable. And coming towards the end, here's just a couple more things I want to show you. The first is looking at this painting at Flamsteed. You'll remember that on the whole, especially in the mid to late 14th century, these dead figures become relatively stiff and they tend to stand, as it were, frontally and look out at the viewer. This figure you can see is a very different sort of pose, a twisting, turning pose. Um, and it, I think, represents the contamination from a different source. We've talked about the way, for example, at Eltram Walter, we have the use of multiple sources, and this is just an example of a source that's used there. And we have, this is the most extraordinary thing, we have this wrapper from some church wardens' accounts, later church wardens' accounts. This appears to be either the sort of document that an artist had with them to remind them of the details of this subject, or it was a design that they shared with the church to basically seal the contract to confirm which subjects they were drawing on the walls of the church. That's the detail of the images of the three living there. You can see that effectively through this we're viewing this process of transfer. We're viewing the way in which this subject went to the parishes, the way in which artists carried these designs, which originated in that very elite manuscript context, how they carried them out into the parishes and shared them with the parishes. You can also see this elaboration, particularly these images from Raun's, the skeletons, and the figure of the landscape. I'm very grateful to Ellie, who's these are her slides, but you can see here we have the beautiful green landscape. We have the rabbits. So when people are hawking on foot, when they're going hunting on foot, it's rabbits that they're going after. So this is why we have the rabbits and the hares. On the far right-hand side here, you can see a figure of a hermit. So it's a motif coming from the Southern European tradition. And you see the height of fashion in which these figures are dressed. But when we look at the figure at Flamsteed and this twisting figure, it's much more like a figure from the Dance of Death, an animated dancing figure. I suspect what we see here is some cross-fertilization with the motifs from the Dance of Death coming in there from those subjects. The Dance of Death is figures literally meeting the moment of their death. So in the 14th century tradition, drawing, as I say, on Romance literature, monastic traditions and folklore, the three dead are there to warn the living, and they are essentially on the side of the living. They are benign. They may be even, as it were, ancestors of the living who want to, who should be objects of pity and who should be prayed for, and so on. When you have the Dance of Death, that is people's moment of death, and how different people, different classes of society, different professions respond to that moment of death, being confronted and led away by the figure of death. So this is sort of typical representation, and you can see that the different sorts of emotional, spiritual reactions that are played out through the figures. But what we start to see at the end of the 15th century, which we don't see in England, but which, you know, perhaps comes closer to the idea of the zombie, the idea of the belligerent dead, the idea of the violent dead, is we see not just the dead approaching. Here you've got an elaborate landscape with a cross in the centre of the road, a crossroads setting where the dead and the living meet. But what you start to see is the living being assaulted by the dead. That the dead are not simply leading the living, out of this life, but that they are violently attacking them. And so we come to the end of the medieval period, and a painting which is in its style and its concept highly Renaissance, highly elaborate, with that sense of landscape. But here we have a classicizing battle, a Renaissance battle between the living and the dead, in contrast to the wall painting tradition that we have in England, in continental wall paintings and in these manuscripts. The dead do turn nasty, and meeting the three dead is no longer simply, as it were, a moralizing encounter, but it is a horrific encounter, closer to a sort of modern concept of what is horrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. That was absolutely fantastic. If people can either turn their cameras or their microphones on to to indicate. That's it. That's it. Thank you.